I must admit that when I started writing, about this topic, I thought that there would be, a lot more academic material on the topic. And while I was looking for, material to guide me, I found that the whole discipline had analyzed the problems facing the Gulf states upside down, and it is as if they, in a lot of cases throughout all of the axioms of international relations, such as, regional stability, furthering of interests, economics, and they reduced the whole, role of the Gulf in the post-Arab Spring states to regime survival. And some went as far, and this is an academic article, as to espouse the notion of double standards as a foreign policy. And so I had to basically pioneer in my own way, and re-navigate where and the steps and where things, if you see the accusations now, even on this panel itself, I apologize, Dr. Otway, but there are some truths that end up getting changed and they become the new realities, conventional wisdom. For example, the US expectations that you mentioned, expectations of the USA, and this has now become academic literature. We are expecting the USA to do things for us. This is actually not what happened. What happened was the Gulf agreed with Britain and France and the USA that the bloodshed in Syria has gone too far, and that even though we had non-interventionist principles, and Qatar and Turkey in the beginning wanted, and Saudi Arabia wanted Assad to stabilize, he took it too far. There were humanitarian concerns that could no longer be ignored. There were chemical weapons that could be used, and indeed eventually were used. And we agreed with the USA and Europe that we would begin arming the rebels, followed by US airstrikes, topple Assad, bring back, a good, strong regime to Syria, not because of democracy, but because the humanitarian cost was no longer acceptable. What happened then was that the USA left us and Saudi Arabia holding the bag when they suddenly said we have congressional limitations. Britain withdrew because their parliament didn't allow them. France withdrew, and these were not the assurances that we received in advance. And then it becomes the Qatari and the Saudi Arabian insistence on interfering in Syria, according to them, that has brought ISIS to the fore. Completely forgetting that we were allies, we were together, we decided the bloodshed was enough, and the only reason that Assad did not fall was because they withdrew on their commitments and left us holding the bag, and left us trying to contain, the powder keg that's about to explode. And so when you hear my presentation, you might think that all this challenges everything that's being said so far, but because what has been said so far has conveniently ignored many aspects of the actual history of the Arab Springs, conveniently ignored many aspects of how states calculate what their regional interests are, and try to explain it in terms of regime survival or hypocrisy or intervention, as if we were the only ones who thought that Bashar al-Assad's actions were enough, and as if there were no commitments made to us by the EU or the USA. So basically, the role of all the Gulf countries in the relation to the Arab Spring was based on their protection of their national interest. All countries in the Gulf acted based on their understanding of what policies would further internal and regional stability in the end. And the actions of the Gulf states were proactive rather than reactive, reactive rather than proactive. So we did not seek to recreate the region. We acted based on what the Arab Spring threw at us in terms of challenges. And it's been very complicated for the Gulf states to formulate the response to the Arab Spring. And the reason behind this is that the Arab Spring is fluid. So it's not actor or space specific. It spreads, it gets pushed back, moves again. Nobody knows where the next event is going to occur, in what state, and what actor is going to be responsible for this. You've seen the emergence of extremely dangerous non-state actors that were previously not part of the calculation. And the Gulf states do not have a doctrine to deal with these emergent non-state actors, like whether you agree with it or not, for the Bush doctrine in the States, which is we are going to commit airstrikes against any threat that emerges against us. There is no doctrine to deal with these things, and so they are threatened by almost all non-state actors, with the exception of Qatar not viewing the Muslim Brotherhood as the threat, but they all agree on the grounds of Hezbollah, ISIS, and the Houthis in Yemen. So, what happened in Egypt and Tunisia? The ousting of Tunisia's Ben Ali and Mubarak of Egypt brought new governments to power, and they caused regional states to fear a change in the alliance system and balance of power in the region. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had close military and economic relations with Egypt, and were cautious of a turn of events that would at best leave them without their ally, and at worst create a regime that was allied against them. Qatar also had economic interests in Egypt, but viewed this interest in allying itself with the new Egyptian government, as it did not believe that the events of the Arab Spring could be reversed, and it viewed that returning to the previous status quo was not an option. In Syria, at the beginning of the uprising, Qatar and Saudi Arabia both preferred to maintain the status quo. The reason for this were based on the fact that Qatar and Saudi Arabia had both improved their relations with Syria over the past decade. And Saudi Arabia had also reached an important agreement with Syria regarding Lebanon. The focus of Qatar and Saudi Arabia was slowly to change policies of the Syrian regime by drawing it away from Iran and closer to the point of view of the GCC and Turkey at the time, rather than confronting it directly or seeking to overthrow it. And Qatar and Turkey sent envoys to Syria when the bloodshed started to begin, requesting the regime to meet some of the protesters' demands in order to maintain stability. For 6 months, none of the protesters' demands were met, and the violence of the regime increased. The regime's violence changed the equation for the Qataris and the Saudi Arabians due to humanitarian concerns. And they do not condone the bloodshed that's going on in Syria, and they do not want to be associated. They can no longer associate themselves with a regime that commits so much bloodshed. And there were concerns of public opinion at home. A point of no return in the Syrian and the relations between Syria, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia had been reached after calls were made for Assad to step down, and the GCC states voted to expel Syria from the Arab League. The Syrian regime responded by sanctioning attacks on the embassies of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey in Damascus. The Syrian regime could no longer be relied upon to become the regional partner they had hoped it would become, leaving the Assad regime with Iran as its only regional ally, and thus placing Syria firmly in the Iranian sphere of influence. The fact that the Gulf states were excluded from the nuclear negotiations with Iran caused further security concerns, because if Iran suddenly becomes stronger after a nuclear deal with America, and its role in Syria has now been has expanded due to its former allies in the region or friends in the region stepping back from it, they were more worried now about the balance of power equation than they were before. They were more because their main worry was maintaining the status quo. So this made countering Iranian hegemony in Syria and Iraq a higher strategic priority. The strategic calculations of Qatar and Saudi Arabia changed, and the ouster of President Assad and his regime was now a goal. The removal of Assad would further regional stability by gaining a new ally in Syria and removing an Iranian ally, thus reducing the Iranian threat to their interest in Lebanon and in the region as a whole. Now, the emergence of ISIS is a very important, it's the second phase of the GCC relations after the Arab Spring. And this is because ISIS shuffled all of the cards, and for the first time since the first diplomatic incident between Qatar and Egypt, the Qatari foreign minister actually met with the Egyptian foreign minister and the Saudi Arabians in Jeddah to discuss a united strategy against ISIS. And I think the emergence of ISIS also played a big role in ending the rift within the GCC states that is partly due to the view of Saudi Arabia and the UAE that Qatar is allied with the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, why is ISIS a bigger threat? ISIS is unpredictable, and their calculations for loss and gain are not the same as the calculations of loss or gain as a state. So predicting what moves would hurt it and what moves you shouldn't make because they would help it are actually more difficult. They've managed to advance at surprising speeds into Iraq. Nobody knows what would happen if Baghdad fell. And now the Gulf states have three choices in Syria, in Iraq, none of which are, very good. And they have two choices in Syria, and none of which are very good. And this drove further cooperation, and I think there will be even more cooperation in the future between the Gulf states, and each other, and eventually with Turkey. The three choices that are available now in Iraq are to either the Kurds defeat ISIS, which would bring a security threat to Turkey, which would further destabilize the region, and it would also remove potentially, Kirkuk from the hold of the Iraqi government, and that would change the oil equation in the region, and they would have a new major player and would threaten the Iraqi government supplies to Turkey. So the geopolitical implications of a Kurdish occupation of Iraqi government land, which I think is possible because I don't think they would stop at the borders of Kurdistan if they started to expand, southwards. That is not a pretty option for the GCC. The other option in Iraq is an ISIS victory, and we don't need to explain why that would be a dangerous option for the GCC. And the third option, the ISIS defeating the Iraqi government and the Kurds, and that's not a pretty option for the GCC. And the third option, which I think is what they're betting on right now, but it's not a safe bet, but we have no alternative, is that the Iraqi government defeats ISIS. The Kurdistan regional government is stabilized but stays within its agreed upon borders. But that is a dangerous option as well, because the circumstances that created ISIS were due to the Iraqi government's marginalization and the Iraqi government's paying a blind eye to the ethnic cleansing of the Sunni population and the Christian population of Iraq. And there are no guarantees that if the Iraqi government wins in Iraq now, there are no guarantees that they will take measures to stop the ethnic cleansing. Even if they wanted to, their military has proven to be ineffective, in controlling their thing. So we don't even know if they intend to, but even if they intended to, they might need maybe 10 to 15 years to actually achieve, stability that would remove the environment that creates this radicalism and gives the far-right preachers the supporters they need in their thousands. Syria, there are currently two options, and that's either the Assad victory or the victory of ISIS. I don't think any party can have a complete victory between them, which would then drag Syria into a prolonged state of civil unrest, and geopolitically, humanitarianly, it's a very, saddening thing. But the reason we only have these two options is, as I said previously, is the United States and Britain withdrew and France from their prior commitments, and they reneged on their promises to support us and decided instead to play a blame game with us and blame us for the emergence of ISIS, completely forgetting history and completely forgetting their prior commitments, which if they stuck to, we would not be talking about ISIS today. And if, they return to their senses and they realize that they should not have inflamed the fires in Syria and created this by talking more than they were willing to act, I think that both the Assad regime and ISIS can be pushed back. Now, I don't think this is going to happen. I think that this blame game will continue, terrorism, Islam, I don't know what, the relation between Islam and terrorism, blah, blah, blah. But what is the other option that we have now as the Gulf states? And there are signs that this is coming to emerge. Is if the UAE and Saudi Arabia put aside their differences with Turkey and come to a united security understanding for what needs to happen in Iraq and Syria in order to stabilize the region. Why? Because there are 4 current threats now in the region. The Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, ISIS, and the Muslim Brotherhood according to Saudi Arabia. In the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, they have been significantly weakened, I think, to allow the Saudi Arabians and the Turks and the Qataris and the UAE to come to an understanding that, whether or not Turkey is pro-Muslim Brotherhood or not, would not significantly affect the cooperation between these countries. With regard to the Houthis in Yemen, I think the Turks are indifferent. So whatever policy the Gulf decides to formulate towards them, it will not affect our relations with Turkey. With regards to Hezbollah in Lebanon and ISIS in Syria, the 2 main threats in the Levant region, the goals and the objectives of Turkey and the Gulf are identical. What is preventing security cooperation between us is the former issue of the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Saudi Arabians and the UAE see this as a threat. Now they have come to an understanding with Qatar, with the return of the ambassadors, and they agreed to host the GCC summit in Qatar, which was previously thought that might be cancelled or moved to another location. And I think that now that this opportunity has emerged, Qatar can use its significant relations with Turkey to play the role of a mediator to then bring more cooperation out of necessity between Turkey, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in order to prevent any 2 of those outcomes occurring in Syria, either the victory of the Assad regime or the victory of ISIS, both which, if they succeed, will pose a threat to the region. Let us not forget that Bashar al-Assad previously fired missiles into Turkey, and there have already been border clashes between Turkey and Syria. So a stable, not stable by European standards, but stable by what can be expected in Syria, stable Bashar al-Assad will or might decide to use violence against Turkey or the GCC. So his regime's survival is a security threat to both Turkey and the GCC. And in Iraq, the Iraqi regime is not a security threat, but I think we must formulate a plan to better guarantee that the Iraqi regime can prevent this environment from taking root again, in which another ISIS will emerge after this one is destroyed. And thank you very much.